nuances there, but I like where you're going with that. That was an interesting point.
Well, and then along with that, Gregory Maguire's novel, it was more like, Elphaba was predisposed to have magical abilities. Hers were just, off the charts, so they were more noticeable, but, they had the option to train in the arts as well in that context.
And I'm a Star Wars kid, so born a Jedi or not. I started thinking of all these other movies that have come out where you're secretly born into something.
Charmed comes to mind.
Yeah.
Check the midichlorian levels.
Well, the wizards in Lord of the Rings too, they were born into it.
Yeah.
There's sort of, that's the odd thing about the wizards though, is that they sort of happen. They never come from anywhere. There's no parent wizard or witch. They just sort of emerged one day and said, well, I guess we're a group of wizards hanging out in Middle-earth. It's always very complicated in Silmarillion.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I had a really long phase where I did this.
I got a synopsis from it from a friend, so that's what I'm going off of. I haven't read that one yet.
They happen that way.
Yeah. I love his backstories. His backstories are amazing.
And I think the medieval story of the origin of Merlin was that he was born magic, but one of his parents was a demon.
Yeah. It's a sort of changeling thing.
So he was born demonic, but he manages to be baptized, so he's got some two warring sides.
He opts into good.
Right.
I wonder if you could use that as a turning point then in kind of at least pop culture. Because I mean, you think about 20th century, a lot of our wizard ideas are based on Merlin.
But which Merlin, basically, it was, I think he first appears in the 12th century, kind of develops from then on. But yeah, that's really neat. And then, I don't know if this shows up in the Malleus Maleficarum, but the idea of the third nipple as an identification, that would sort of imply being born into the tendency, right?
Yeah, even in the Salem witchcraft trials, they would do examinations where they would interrogate and examine for weird birthmarks or things like that, so.
So, but it does seem as though it's not until the late 20th century that there's really something like made of this idea of being born into it.
Which is kind of funny because it does sort of fight back against the other main impulse in especially, children and YA fiction, which is the idea you can be anything you want to be if you work hard enough, right? That's, going all the way back to some of the 19th century didactic fiction, right? But if you're not born with sorceress talent in all of these series, and even more, you can't. Right, it might not be sufficient, but it's absolutely necessary, which is kind of a strange shifting of that narrative.
But could it be playing to the way our social levels are today? Like you have to be born into like high society to be in high society. Like there's that emerging like distance.
Well, you're right. I would say there absolutely is, but we don't normally see that in literature. So are you suggesting that this sort of way that it's sort of sublimated into literature?
Yeah, like it's kind of like, like you have to be born into privilege. Like being born into magic is kind of like being born into this extra privilege. And so it's kind of like mirroring that theme of social groups or levels, or I can't think of the term right now.
Well, and then coming off of that, I would also argue that you look at it racially, because Harry Potter is basically a underground Holocaust. Voldemort wants to take over the Muggles. He wants to rule them because power is might, and so there's that idea of, okay, they were born with these extra gifts, we're going to use them, and we're better than everyone else because they don't have them.
And there's a book that just came out that might be very interesting about, it's called the Physic Book of Deliverance Dane. And the woman who is the main character in the book is a graduate student, and the ultimate problem is that, her advisor is evil, but that doesn't happen in the real world.
What was that?
Fiction or non-fiction?
It is a fictional book, but basically she's a graduate student, and she's able to trace her biological heritage back to a woman who died during the Salem witch trials. And her name is Constance, her mother was Grace, and when you get a little bit further back, they start coming out like Prudence and Deliverance and all of the characteristics of, you know, a good solid woman. But this magical part of her has been passed down, and somehow her evil advisor had known that when she applied to the program, accepted her because he wanted to take advantage of her knowledge and family traditions. And it was great. I listened to it in my car while I was driving back and forth. It was spectacular. But so that would be something else that goes to the idea that, you know, you're born into this tradition, but it also it's fun to play with the graduate student model.
I also think it would be interesting to explore more of an oral tradition model, because especially in the Renaissance and in the Salem witch trial era, you don't write about how these witchcraft is passed down, if it is at all. The people who were midwives didn't write texts about it. This is what you do if this happens. So if there is any kind of available oral literature, oral histories on the specific actual witches who were practicing, I think that would be interesting to compare against the literature about their era and what comes out later.
And going off of that, for one of you that's currently applying to graduate school, that might be a really great thing to plan to do for your dissertation, because I think that even searching for the documents might be outside the scope of your current project, but it would definitely be something worth looking into going forward. That would be really cool.
One last thing I'd add is you might be able to make the argument too that being born into it makes it more acceptable in a conservative Christian society. You know, it's because I remember one of the arguments that came up all the time was, well, they would tell the Southern Baptists they don't have to worry about their kids becoming wizards because they got to be born into it, and so unless they're magic, they don't have to worry about it. You know. But yeah, I mean, there's that flip side of it. I wonder, you know, if I don't think J.K. Rowling or anybody else consciously said, you know, let me write it this way because it gives an excuse for it to not happen.
Other comments or suggestions for our panel?
The witch trials I thought were interesting as an example of kind of pressure cooker kind of moment, right, where this happens. This is so early in the settlement of British North America. These people haven't been there very long. They've all self-selected to come over. So it's basically this subset of English society. They're all Puritans. Why do they start turning on each other? It's because they're trying to purify themselves even more. Cotton Mather then later says, oh no, this isn't good enough. We need to move to Mexico to make a new country there to try again to get it right. I think in some ways it's part of that it's not like the European witch hunts where there really is people doing a variety of different things. I mean, you have the slave and maybe people like that, and then the fear from the outside.
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done on cunning folk. Owen Davies might be somebody worth looking into, but and they talk about the lack of cunning folk within the United States, or what becomes the United States. And I'm not sure about that, because there are some individuals within other non-English cultures that could be classified as cunning folk, but that might be interesting to look into as well.
I have two more comments / questions. One of them is, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there someone who wasn't Betty or Abigail or somebody apologized later?
Yeah.
For
a lot of
for
times
blaming?
people would most of the town actually, after it was all over, kind of admitted to getting caught up. And that's why I kind of made a point to say that Cotton Mather and William Stoughton were two that were steadfast in it till the end, because a lot of people really did kind of recant that.
I bet he's in hysteria, absolutely. Another thing for Kelsey is, this might be a little bit far, but it's very pop culture, is the Witches President True Blood and the vampiric kind of things that are coming out. I know that's a bit too far from what you're doing, but it might be, I mean, interesting or something.
Isn't there a new TV show coming out where the different characters from fairy tales
There's-
show up in
yes.
this town?
You can either
Yes.
have storybooks, or you can have Grimms,
Yes.
where you have the detective descendant of the Grimms who can see the fairy tale figures and will hunt them down, or you can have the storybook one where a whole bunch of people have apparently moved to Maine from the land of fairy tales, and I read a lot of TV guides.
It's Once Upon a Time. This show's Once Upon a Time.
Once Upon a Time.
Or Grimm or whatever.
The one that looks like Fables.
It looks kind of cheesy to me. I don't know. Like, Grimm's looks better.
In the impromptu review of upcoming from the producers of Lost. Anything else? Any more comments?
Well, I'm sure that our panelists would appreciate any other comments or suggestions that you have, especially as they are developing their projects and moving forward into the process of applying to graduate school and hopefully getting into graduate school and completing their programs, so.
I have kind of a little critique. Derek, you mentioned when you were talking about the king during Shakespeare's time, you said something having to do with the witches that you brought up in Macbeth, like you proposed a question, but you didn't answer it.
Yes, I didn't answer it simply for the fact that
Okay.
I have to do a little bit more research into it.
Okay, but
Yeah.
I was just suggesting like don't propose
Right.
questions if you're not gonna answer
Yeah.
them in your
And
presentation.
I actually meant to say something. I know it's going to take a little bit more research for the fact that I got to look more into, like, I have to get. See, I took Shakespeare simply from my perspective in this instance. I got to look more into Shakespeare from like scholarly instances of, you know, what do they have to say about it, and more into pretty much the ideology behind witchcraft during this time period. This was pretty much just like an overview for me right now. I had a lot to do from the ascent of civilization to the Renaissance time period. But hopefully I will be able to cover that question within my final honors thesis that is going to pretty much cover the entire time period of witchcraft. So hopefully I will be able to answer that, and it's a lengthy paper, so it's going to be like 70 pages long. So hopefully I can answer a lot of the questions that have posed, but
It was just a critique for future presentations. You just, like, usually you don't propose questions you don't have answers to in the middle of your presentation, so that was.
Questions are very interesting because often they can be used to then elicit discussion as well.
Absolutely.
But I would also like to just slip in a little promo since it looks like we'll be ending a little bit early today. Just down the street is the Lilly Library, right? It's mentioned in our program books. They have both a room with an exhibit set up specifically for our conference about, you know, folklore resources and materials in the Lilly, and I'm sure they've got some of the early editions of Pura and Grimm on display. But also, they have the big exhibit that they just mounted this week is the English Bible to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the King James translation. And they've got manuscripts and medieval manuscripts and other really cool stuff to look at. They also have out right at the front corner of that is the Shakespeare First Folio that the Lilly owns. So if you would like to see the First Folio on display, they're open until 6 o'clock this afternoon from 9 to 1 tonight. Just 2 blocks away. You walk over.
Anything else? Then we could end early.
And everyone
If
can go to the
everyone would
library.
like. Thank you all for coming.